There is a particular kind of anxiety that has no good explanation. Not the anxiety before a job interview or a difficult conversation, not the racing heart before something that is genuinely frightening. This is a different animal entirely. This is the anxiety that is simply there when you wake up, before your eyes fully open, before the day has made a single demand, before anything has happened at all. You lie there and it is already present. A low hum in the chest, a tightness in the throat, a sense of impending something that you cannot name because there is nothing to name. The world outside is quiet. Your life, by most measurable standards, is fine. And yet your body is running as if a predator is standing just outside the door. You have tried to explain it to people, to doctors, to partners, to yourself, and the explanation is never quite fit. Because how do you describe a fear that has no object? How do you ask for help with a danger that exists only in the circuitry of your own nervous system? So you learn to manage it. You develop rituals. You avoid certain situations. You control what you can. You stay busy so the stillness cannot catch up with you. And somewhere along the way, you stop questioning it and simply accept it as the texture of your life. If this is the anxiety you know, not occasionally, but as a daily companion you never invited and could never quite evict, then what you're about to hear is not another management strategy. It is an explanation, finally, a real one. And it will change the way you understand not just your anxiety, but yourself. We need to begin by dismantling the most common and most damaging story told about anxiety. The story goes like this. Anxiety is a disorder. It is a malfunction. Something in your brain is misfiring, producing fear responses that are disproportionate to reality. The solution, therefore, is to correct the malfunction through medication, through cognitive restructuring, through breathing techniques that teach your nervous system to calm down. These approaches are not without value, but they share a fundamental assumption that Dr. Gabor Mate's work challenges at the root. They assume that the anxiety is the problem. Mate's framework, developed across decades of clinical work with patients suffering from addiction, chronic illness, and psychological distress, proposes something entirely different. He argues that chronic anxiety is not a malfunction. It is a memory. It is the nervous system's faithful recording of an environment that was once genuinely dangerous. Not dangerous in the way that adulthood appears dangerous, but dangerous in the most primal and devastating way a human being can experience danger. The danger of not being safe in the presence of the people you needed for survival. This reframe is not semantic. It is not a gentle rebranding of the same problem. It is a fundamental shift in where you look for the answer. Because if anxiety is a malfunction, you fix it. But if anxiety is a memory, if it is intelligence that was learned in a specific environment for a specific reason, then fixing it is not the right word. The right word is understanding. And the right question is not, how do I make this stop? But rather, what was happening when this anxiety was first learned? And does that situation still exist? In most cases, for most of the people carrying anxiety they cannot explain, the answer to the second question is no. The situation no longer exists, but the nervous system never received the memo. To understand why, we need to understand what happens to a child who grows up in an emotionally unpredictable environment. And by unpredictable, Mate does not exclusively mean violent or overtly abusive. He means any environment in which the child could not reliably predict whether their emotional needs would be met. A parent who was loving one day and withdrawn the next. A household where the emotional temperature could shift without warning. A caregiver whose own unresolved anxiety or depression meant that the child's needs were sometimes visible and sometimes invisible, depending on the day. In these environments, the child's nervous system does something extraordinary. It goes on permanent alert. It has to, because in an environment where safety is inconsistent, the only survival strategy available is constant vigilance. The child learns to monitor every micro expression of the caregiver's face, every shift in tone, every silence that might mean danger. They become extraordinarily attuned to the emotional atmosphere around them because their safety depends on reading it accurately. This vigilance is not anxiety in the clinical sense. It is biological intelligence. It is the nervous system doing exactly what it was designed to do in exactly the conditions it was given. The devastating part is what happens next. The child grows up. The environment changes. They are no longer dependent on an unpredictable caregiver for survival. They move through the world as a capable adult with resources and autonomy and choices the child never had. But the nervous system does not automatically update. It is still running the old software. It is still scanning for the threat that was only present in 1987 or 1994 or 2003. It is still bracing for the emotional withdrawal, the sudden anger, the unpredictable shift, because no one told it that those conditions are over. And so you wake up every morning with anxiety that has no object. Because the object was never the present. The object was always the past. This is what Mate means when he says the body remembers what the mind was forced to forget. The mind moved on. The mind built a career, a relationship, a life. But the body is still a child in an unpredictable house, listening at the door. This is where 30 years of anxiety lives, not in the chemical imbalance, not in the cognitive distortion, in a nervous system that never learned it was finally safe. And this is where the first shift begins, the shift that changes everything. The first thing that ends chronic anxiety is not calming the nervous system. It is understanding what the nervous system is trying to say. Most anxiety management strategies work in opposition to the anxiety. They try to slow the breath to counter the racing heart. They try to challenge the thoughts to interrupt the worry spiral. They try, in essence, to convince the body that it is wrong. But according to Mate's framework, the body is not wrong. It is responding with perfect logic to a map that is outdated. And the path forward is not to override the body's signal, it is to listen to it with enough curiosity and compassion that you can finally understand what it has been trying to tell you. What does this look like in practice? It means when the anxiety arrives, that familiar hum in the chest, that tightness in the throat, instead of immediately trying to make it stop, you pause. You turn toward it rather than away from it. You ask, with genuine curiosity, not what is wrong with me, but what is this responding to? What old situation does this moment remind my body of? Whose face, whose tone, whose unpredictability does this person or situation unconsciously echo? This is not a simple practice. It requires a quality of self-compassion that many people who grew up in emotionally unsafe environments have never been given permission to develop. Because the same childhood that created the anxiety often also created the harsh inner critic that says, stop being so sensitive, you're overreacting, there's nothing to be afraid of, pull yourself together. That voice is not wisdom. That voice is the internalization of every adult who ever dismissed your emotional reality when you were small. And it is one of the most significant barriers to healing. Mate's work is clear on this point. You cannot heal a nervous system from a place of war with yourself. You can only heal from a place of compassionate witnessing, from the place that says, of course you feel this way. Look at what you learned. Look at what your body had to carry. Of course it learned to brace. Of course it learned to scan. Of course it never fully relaxed. That understanding offered to yourself by yourself is not indulgence. It is the most direct medicine available for chronic anxiety. The second thing that ends chronic anxiety is grieving the safety you never had. This sounds strange. Grief and anxiety seem like different categories of experience, but from a trauma-informed perspective, they are deeply intertwined. Chronic anxiety is in part a grief response that was never allowed to complete itself. Here's what that means. When a child grows up in an emotionally unsafe environment, they experience loss. Not the loss that comes with death or visible devastation, but a quieter, more insidious loss. The loss of the secure base they should have had. The loss of the caregiver who could regulate their own emotions and hold the child's emotions with steadiness and warmth. The loss of the experience of being genuinely soothed, not just told to stop crying, but actually held in a way that taught the nervous system that distress can be survived. This loss is real. But the child cannot grieve it in real time because the child does not have the language, the safety, or the emotional support required for grief. So the loss remains unprocessed, stored in the body as a kind of perpetual anticipatory grief. A grief that expresses itself not as sadness, but as chronic low-level fear. As the constant sense that something is about to go wrong. Because for the child, something always was. When healing begins, real healing, not symptom management, the grief eventually surfaces. And when it does, it can feel like a worsening of anxiety, or a strange, inexplicable sadness that arises alongside moments of peace. Psychologists who work within a trauma-informed framework consistently observe that this grief must be moved through, not bypassed. Because on the other side of the grief, for the safety you never had, is something you may have never fully experienced. The realization that you are safe now, not because someone gave you safety, because you built it, because you survived what should not have been yours to survive, and you are here, and the environment has fundamentally changed, even if your nervous system is not caught up. Grieving the past is the nervous system's most direct route to the present. The third thing that ends chronic anxiety is renegotiating your relationship with your own body. For most people with chronic anxiety, the body has become the enemy. It is the thing that betrays you in meetings, that catastrophizes in the middle of the night, that produces symptoms with no regard for whether the threat is real. You have spent years trying to control it, override it, medicate it into compliance. But Dr. Gabor Mate's work, which draws heavily on the connection between psychological experience and physical health, invites a radical repositioning. The body is not the source of your suffering. It is the messenger of your history. The racing heart is not trying to ruin your day. It is trying to tell you something. It is saying, this situation is activating the same neural pathways that were activated when you were 7 years old and the house was unpredictable and you had to be ready for anything. The tightness in your chest is not a malfunction. It is a recording. It is the physical residue of 1,000 moments when you held your breath so that you would not be too much. The hypervigilance is not a character flaw. It is a skill that was honed to perfection in service of your survival, and it has simply not been retired. When you begin to understand your body's signals as communication rather than malfunction, something extraordinary happens. The war with your own physiology begins to end. And paradoxically, when the body stops being fought, it begins to settle. This is the somatic reality of healing. When you stop overriding the signal and start listening to it, the signal gradually changes. Because the nervous system is not trying to generate fear for the sake of fear, it is trying to protect you. And when it receives the message, through your compassionate attention, through your curious inquiry, through your willingness to feel rather than flee, that its warnings have been received and understood, it begins, slowly and unmistakably, to relax its grip. Not overnight, not completely, but measurably, verifiably, in the body. The fourth thing that ends chronic anxiety is changing the relationships that recreate the original wound. This is the one that requires the most honesty, because it is easy to understand anxiety as a historical artifact, something your childhood gave you that you're now working to undo. What is harder to see is the degree to which your adult life may have been unconsciously constructed to confirm the original wound. Gabor Mate's work on attachment describes how people who grew up in emotionally unsafe environments often recreate that unsafety in adulthood, not to conscious choice, but to the nervous system's tendency to seek out what is familiar. You may have built relationships with people who are emotionally inconsistent because consistency felt boring or suspicious. You may have chosen partners whose availability was conditional because that is what love looked and felt like when the template was installed. You may have built a professional life around constant high-stakes pressure because relaxation never felt safe. In each of these cases, the adult environment is continuously activating the childhood nervous system. The body never gets the chance to learn that peace is possible because the environment keeps reproducing the original conditions that made peace impossible. This is not blame, this is biology. The nervous system is doing exactly what it learned to do. But seeing it clearly, seeing how your current life may be inadvertently feeding the very anxiety you are trying to heal, is one of the most liberating and most difficult steps in genuine recovery. Because changing these patterns requires tolerating the discomfort of the unfamiliar. It requires choosing partners whose consistency feels strange at first. It requires building professional environments that do not run on adrenaline. It requires sitting with the eerie calm of a life that is not on the edge, and staying there long enough for the nervous system to accept that the calm is real. The fifth thing that ends chronic anxiety is the most difficult to describe, because it is less a practice and more an arrival. It is the moment when you stop identifying the anxiety as you. For 30 years, the anxiety was your constant companion. It was the first thing you felt in the morning and the last thing you carried to sleep. It shaped your decisions, your relationships, your career, your sense of what was possible, and over time, it became indistinguishable from your identity. You did not have anxiety, you were an anxious person. It was woven into your self-concept so completely that the idea of existing without it felt not like freedom, but like the loss of something essential. According to Mate's framework, this identification is one of the most subtle and most stubborn aspects of trauma-based anxiety. Because the adaptive self, the self that was built around the original wound, incorporates the anxiety as a defining feature. And when you begin to heal, when the anxiety begins to lift, there can be a strange grief, a disorientation, a loss of familiar ground. Who am I without this is not an abstract question. It is the most concrete question available. Because the anxiety organized your life. It kept you safe in a particular way. It justified your vigilance, your avoidance, your control. And letting it go means letting go of the entire architecture that was built around it. This is the threshold that most people approach and then quietly retreat from. Not because they are weak, but because the authentic self, the self that exists in the absence of the survival response, is unfamiliar territory. And unfamiliar to a nervous system trained on vigilance can feel indistinguishable from unsafe. But here's what Mate's work makes clear. The authentic self is not a vacuum. It is not the absence of personality or feeling or intensity. It is the fullness that was always present beneath the anxiety, the curiosity, the creativity, the capacity for genuine connection, the ability to be moved by things, not because you are bracing against the world, but because you are finally open to it. The anxiety was not you. It was the armor you wore in a war you did not choose. And the person underneath the armor, the one who has been waiting quietly and patiently through all of it, is more whole, more interesting, and more alive than the anxiety ever allowed you to know. Stop here for a moment and let this actually land, not as information, not as something to analyze or evaluate or apply to someone else you know who has anxiety. Let it land in your own chest, in your own body, in the place that recognized itself the moment this video began. 30 years, or 20, or 10, however long you have been carrying this. It was not a disease. It was not a flaw in your design. It was a faithful, intelligent, devoted response to a childhood that asked too much of your nervous system and offered too little in return. You were not overreacting. You were under-supported. You were not too sensitive. You were carrying more than any child should ever have had to carry, with fewer resources than any child should ever have been left with. The hypervigilance was not neurosis, it was protection. The anxiety was not weakness. It was the only appropriate response to an environment where safety was genuinely unpredictable. And you survived it. You took that impossible environment, you extracted every tool it had to offer, and you built yourself a life. With all the limitations the wound imposed, you built something. You kept going. You showed up. You are here. That is not nothing. That is extraordinary. And now the invitation is not to fix yourself. It is to understand yourself deeply, honestly, compassionately enough that the nervous system finally receives the message it has been waiting for since you were small. The danger has passed. You are safe. You're allowed to put on the armor. You're allowed to be still without bracing. You're allowed to feel peace without waiting for it to be taken from you. You're allowed to be here exactly as you are without the vigilance. That permission offered to yourself, from yourself, grounded in genuine understanding rather than forced positivity, is the thing that ends the anxiety. Not immediately and not completely, but fundamentally in the place where it was born. Healing from anxiety rooted in complex trauma is not a linear journey. There's no day when you wake up and the nervous system is fully at peace. But there are days, more and more of them, gradually and unmistakably, when you notice that the hum is quieter. When you realize you've been in a room full of people without scanning for danger. When someone raises their voice and you feel startled rather than shattered. When you sit in silence and notice that the silence is not threatening, it is just quiet. These moments are not small. They are evidence of a nervous system learning, at last, what it never had the chance to learn when it mattered most. That the world can be safe, that people can be trustworthy, that peace is not a trap, that you do not have to earn your right to exist in every room you enter. Learning these things as an adult, after a lifetime of the opposite, is one of the most courageous things that a human being can do. It requires you to sit with the unfamiliar. It requires you to grieve what was lost. It requires you to choose again and again the terrifying openness of genuine living over the familiar closeness of vigilance. But it is possible, not as a destination, as a direction, as a daily, imperfect, profoundly worthwhile practice of turning toward yourself with the curiosity and compassion you deserved from the very beginning. If this kind of exploration resonates with you, if this is the kind of understanding you want to continue building, consider subscribing so these conversations can continue to find you when you need them most. And before you go, I want to ask you something genuinely. What was the moment or the realization in this video that felt most true to your own experience? When did you feel most recognized? Leave that in the comments, not because it helps an algorithm, but because naming your own experience in your own words, in the presence of others who understand, that is itself a small act of healing. I will leave you with this. The anxiety was never the truest thing about you. It was the loudest thing. It was the most insistent thing. It was the thing that got all the attention, all the management, all the apology. But underneath it, underneath the hum and the brace and the scan, there's always been something quieter, something that is not afraid, something that knows, even if the nervous system is not yet caught up, that you were always worthy of safety. That something is you, the real you, and it has been waiting with remarkable patience for the anxiety to finally step aside. It is stepping aside. You are healing. And the life that has been waiting on the other side of the fear is more real, more spacious, and more entirely your own than anything the anxiety ever allowed you to imagine. Chronic anxiety is not a flaw in your character. It is a memory stored in your nervous system from a time when hypervigilance was the only safety available to you. What part of this video felt most true to your own experience with anxiety?